So we have some more information when it comes to Impact Wrestling Executive Vice President Don Callis, or possibly former Impact Wrestling Executive Vice President Don Callis, his future with Impact Wrestling. Now, I know we've been talking about this a lot over the course of the last few days or so, but it's a real big story, to be honest, when you look at what Impact Wrestling is going to look like going forward. When you possibly lose an executive from the company, any company, pro wrestling or Fortune 500, any company you want to talk about, losing an executive from that company is a big deal. And it looks like as more and more information is starting to come out when it comes to Don Callis, his future with Impact Wrestling, it's looking more and more likely that the initial thought process that Don Callis was no longer an executive for Impact Wrestling looks to be accurate. Now, this story's been breaking and developing over the course of the last few days. It first started off because, of course, Anthem on their website lists all their executive for all their various companies and properties, and Don Callis had been removed from that. It only listed Scott D'Amore as an executive vice president of Impact Wrestling, and Don Callis was removed from that website. Now, a lot of people said, well, that can mean anything. That could be a work, that could be kayfabe, that can be anything. But obviously, there were reports going back to last year in December. It was Wrestling Inc. that first reported this, and then other outlets picked it up, that Don Callis was expected to leave Impact Wrestling, that his contract with the company was going to expire in January, and the expectation in AEW and Impact Wrestling, for that matter, was that Don Callis was going to leave Impact. He was going to become a talent full-time with AEW, and he was going to be Kenny Omega's manager on screen going forward. That was the report at the time. Now, a lot of people, myself included, pointed out logic issues, pointed out plot holes and potholes in that report initially by Wrestling Inc., and it was kind of forgotten about. But of course, as I mentioned, over the last few days, with the people noticing that Don Callis' profile was removed from the Anthem website, and other people, Sean Ross Sapp, Dave Meltzer, and others reporting that there might be something to this story. It was then reported by Sean Ross Sapp that Don Callis' duties as an Impact Wrestling Executive Vice President had been significantly reduced in recent months. This is when talking to Impact Wrestling talent and people behind the scenes in Impact Wrestling. Well, we have some new news when it comes to Don Callis and his duties, as it were, at the most recent set of Impact Wrestling television tapings. Now, of course, after Impact Wrestling Under Siege had aired this past weekend on Saturday, it was announced and it was reported that there was going to be another set of Impact Wrestling television tapings that was going to cover all of the content for Impact Wrestling in June. This would cover, obviously, Impact Wrestling on Access TV, but it would also cover the Impact Against All Odds Impact Plus special event to air on Impact Plus in June. Of course, that event is going to feature Kenny Omega versus Moose for the Unified Impact World Championship. So Impact have been very busy over the course of the last few days. They've been taping all of this content across 4 days. It's what they do every month, but it means they've got the entirety of June off, unless they're going to be going back to film some extra content, which I don't think is going to be the case. I think these television tapings have finished now, so they've got all of this footage, all of this content in the can, ready to go for the next few months as we as we continue on the road to Slammiversary in July. Well, Sean Ross Sapp, Fightful Select, which of course is their Patreon service. Be sure to subscribe, check it out. They drop a lot of very exclusive and interesting information that is accurate, so be sure to subscribe and check them out. They have posted a new report pertaining to the future of Don Callis and what his duties were at the most recent set of Impact Wrestling television tapings. This is what the report has to say, quote, "We noted this weekend that talent told us that they were under the impression that Don Callis would likely not be in a position of power any longer in Impact Wrestling, and he was removed as a vice president from Anthem Sports and Entertainment's website." Now, in an update, Fightful was informed that Callis was only at the first day of their recent Impact Wrestling television tapings and then wasn't seen again for the remaining 3 days. Fightful have been told that this was also the case for Kenny Omega, and that Impact Wrestling filmed the content they needed for Callis and Omega, and both left the tapings. So this was only after 1 day. Now, Fightful then conclude that they've reached out to Impact Wrestling for more information on this story. So that's a pretty big deal. A pretty big deal. It's a very big deal in that Don Callis, if he was an executive vice president of the company, the minimum would be that he would be there for the entirety of the Impact Wrestling television tapings. He would have been there for all 4 days because he would have been instrumental in overseeing everything on those 4 days, whether it's creative, whether it's production, whether it's talent, whether it's anything. He would have obviously been very, very important to all of that. And he wasn't there. He wasn't there for the Impact Wrestling television taping. So obviously that's significant, isn't it? That's a significant That's a significant update, and I think that goes to show realistically that goes to show it goes to show really what the situation is with Don Callis right now, doesn't it? I think it does. I think it does. People can start talking about this like it was kayfabe and it was a work. But at this point, if it's a work, it's a really, really odd thing to work this significantly. I know that Scott D'Amore and I know that Don Callis have been clashing on Impact Wrestling television as of late. And obviously it does look like going forward there is going to be some form of a storyline on Impact Wrestling television where Scott D'Amore tells Don Callis, well, you can't play both sides. You can't be an Impact Wrestling Executive Vice President and also be the manager of the Impact World Champion and the AEW World Champion in Kenny Omega. You're too biased. You can't be impartial. You can't think about Impact Wrestling because obviously your commitments lie with Kenny Omega, so you can no longer be an Impact Wrestling Executive Vice President. That's how they might justify on Impact Wrestling television to write off Don Callis in terms of being an on-screen authority figure or anything like that. But this report and the other reports that we're hearing are pretty much a confirmation. They're pretty much a confirmation. You have to join the dots, obviously, in this. You have to join the dots and kind of see where this is pointing out. But if Don Callis was an executive vice president still of Impact Wrestling, he would have been there for the entirety of the Impact Wrestling television tapings because that's his job. His job would be to oversee all of the Impact Wrestling television tapings. Whether it comes to production, creative, talent, you name it, it's important that he would be there. And the fact that he isn't speaks volumes. Now, the previous report by Sean Ross Sapp of Fightful said that his duties had been significantly reduced. Well, that's pretty much confirmed with this new report that he was only there for 1 day. I think crucially as well, and this goes to show really where his commitments are now in terms of his relationship with Impact Wrestling and his duties going forward, probably no longer as an executive with the company, is that Kenny Omega was there for 1 day and so was Don Callis. They got the footage they needed from Kenny Omega and Don Callis, and then they were gone after the first day. That, to me, sounds like two AEW contracted talents coming in and fulfilling their obligations to Impact Wrestling as talents and then leaving to ensure that they can be in Jacksonville for AEW Dynamite tonight on TNT. That's what that sounds like to me. That sounds like two AEW talents coming in, working the tapings, doing whatever Impact Wrestling needs from them, and then going back to Jacksonville to work for AEW. And I think that's the most likely situation here. So, again, we don't have any official confirmation right now. We don't have anything officially that says Don Callis has left Impact Wrestling or Don Callis is no longer an executive vice president of Impact Wrestling, but the evidence is beginning to mount now. And I said this when we did the first video talking about Don Callis possibly leaving Impact Wrestling or at the very least no longer being an executive with the company. I said it at the time, give it a couple of days, because initially, as I mentioned at the top of the video, initially it was just a case of why is he no longer listed on the website? We had heard reports last year. People started to put two and two together. But I said at the time, give it a couple of days. There are very reputable journalists. This is a big news story, especially in the world of Impact Wrestling, but obviously it affects AEW as well, and it affects the landscape. It affects the landscape of professional wrestling in general. As I mentioned, for any company, losing an executive in a senior role is a big deal. So I said, give it a couple of days, because these reputable journalists, whether it's Sean Ross Sapp of Fightful, whether it's Dave Meltzer of the Wrestling Observer newsletter, whether it's PW Torch, PW Insider, whoever, whether it's Inside the Ropes, you name it, Sportskeeda, whether it's anyone, people will be ringing up their sources, people will be messaging their sources. They'll find out pretty quickly when it comes to what the situation is with Don Callis, and the information right now leads one to believe, yes, those initial reports talking about Don Callis' future with Impact Wrestling and Anthem no longer being executive vice president of Impact Wrestling look to be accurate, because as I mentioned, and I don't want to sound like I'm repeating myself here, but the writing is very much on the wall, isn't it? The writing is very, very much on the wall right now, whether it's talent saying, you know what, I haven't seen much of Don Callis over the course of the last few months. It's definitely Scott D'Amore leading the charge here. It feels like his duties have been significantly reduced. If I've had an issue or if I've needed anything, I've gone to Scott D'Amore and not Don Callis. Then you look at the website, Don Callis is no longer listed as an executive on there, Scott D'Amore is. Then you now have this report stating that He was only there for one day of the recent television tapings. Usually he was there all the time. He was only there for one day. He was only there when Kenny Omega was there because that's his job. He's only going to be involved there with the Kenny Omega storyline because he's a talent that's just involved with Kenny Omega. He's almost an AEW talent coming in at this point working for Impact Wrestling. And I think that's the situation now. And that tells us everything that needs to be told. Now, do I expect Impact Wrestling or Anthem to release a statement saying that Don Callis is no longer an executive or something like that? Not right now. Not right now, because I do think, personally, I know some people said that they thought kayfabe and they thought it was a work initially. I don't think it's a work. Now, I think Don Callis is no longer an executive vice president of Impact Wrestling, or at the very least, he's on, as I mentioned, gardening leave, and he's on his way out of the company. I don't think Anthem or Impact will confirm this as of right now. I think what they'll probably try to do is tie this into a television storyline. So I could see a situation where maybe as early as this week on Impact Wrestling on Access TV, Scott D'Amore, Don Callis, they have a big blow up against each other, and Scott D'Amore says to Don Callis, you know what, I've spoken to the guys at Anthem, I've spoken to the directors and all this kind of stuff. They've decided you can no longer be impartial, you can no longer be trusted as an executive with the company. Therefore, it has been decided that you have been removed as an executive vice president of Impact Wrestling. You are no longer an executive with this company. Don Callis, you are fired. And then as part of that, then Anthem and Impact release a statement saying that he is no longer officially an executive vice president of the company. And then it's revealed that he has signed, Dave Meltzer, Sean Rossap, whoever, reveals that he has signed a contract to only be a talent with AEW. I think that's maybe a likely destination that they could go. So I don't think that Don Callis is anymore, I don't think he's an executive with Impact Wrestling anymore. I think he is an AEW contracted talent full-time. He's Kenny Omega's manager. But I don't think we're going to get anything official from Impact or Anthem until something plays out on television. And as I mentioned, that can be as early as this week. So I think that's significant. I think it's also interesting when it comes to Kenny Omega. Kenny Omega was only there for one day. Now, obviously, you don't have to tape things in order when it comes to taping things in advance or taping things for Impact Wrestling. So one would assume that if Kenny Omega was there for one day, maybe he filmed a bunch of promos or a bunch of in-ring segments for Impact Wrestling over the course of the next 4 or 5 weeks. He probably taped one match or maybe two at a push, but probably one match, which was Kenny Omega versus Moose, which obviously is taking place at Against All Odds for the Impact World Championship. I'm still under the impression that Kenny Omega will retain the Unified Impact World Championship at Against All Odds. I don't see him dropping the title, as I mentioned, before Slammiversary at the very, very, very earliest. And personally, I don't see him dropping the Unified Impact World Championship until he drops the AEW World Championship. I don't see that happening until All Out, which is August, September. So therefore, if you're going to have Kenny Omega drop the Unified Impact World Championship at a big event, I think it takes place at Bound for Glory in October. That's just my opinion. I haven't heard anything. I don't know. That's the way that I see things going. So I would think Kenny Omega was there for one day, and day one was also almost Kenny Omega Day. They filmed all of the segments, all of the vignettes, all of the matches that they needed Kenny Omega and Don Callis for, and then they've headed back to Jacksonville ready for Dynamite tonight. But as I mentioned, if you start looking at all of these reports together now, and that's important, all of these journalists, all of these reporters, and all of these separate reports are all saying the same thing now. Whether it's Sean Rossap, whether it's Meltzer, whether it's whoever, they're all saying the same thing, and that's Don Callis isn't as influential, or certainly doesn't have the responsibilities that he once had. And the general impression is that if he hasn't already, he has signed with AEW, and he is an AEW contracted talent. He is the manager of Kenny Omega as a talent, and he's no longer an executive with Impact Wrestling, which is a massive story. It's a huge story, and as I mentioned, whilst it looks to be more and more confirmed over the course of the last few days, it certainly isn't the last we've heard about this. So stay tuned, because I'm sure we'll talk about it again over the course of the next few days. Now, before we wrap things up, I did want to talk about this, because it looks to me like Eddie Edwards versus Kenny Omega is possibly the plan for Slammiversary going forward. I think that's why Eddie Edwards pinned Carl Anderson at Impact Under Siege this past Saturday. Given that Kenny Omega was involved in that match, I didn't think it made a ton of sense why Kenny Omega's involved in the match on Impact Wrestling Television that he loses. But the only rationale or reason I could think about that is that it's going to be Eddie Edwards versus Kenny Omega at Slammiversary. That's the direction that they want to go in. There there might be an issue with that because it looks like Kenny Omega's a possible opponent, Eddie Edwards, is possibly suffering from appendicitis. Now, Impact Wrestling could be without one of their featured performers for at least a little while, and putting up his status for Slammiversary firmly up in the air. We don't know how bad this could be. Now, Dave Meltzer has reported on the Wrestling Observer radio show that Eddie Edwards is currently injured with what looks to be like appendicitis. Now, the extent of the injury is currently unknown, though, so we don't know how long he's going to be out for, if he's going to be out, if he's going to miss any ring time, what's his status for Slammiversary. Everything's certainly up in the air, but it looks like he's suffering with appendicitis. This is what Meltzer had to say, quote, "I know he's in Nashville right now, or was on Monday afternoon. Basically, what I was told it looks like is appendicitis, which is not a good thing at all, but I don't have any details as far as if he's having his appendix out right now or what is the situation." Now, if Edwards does indeed have appendicitis, he could be on the shelf for 4 to 6 weeks, depending on which type of surgery he does have. Now, as I mentioned, this is significant because this could put his Slammiversary status up in the air. If he's out of action for, say, 6 weeks, that means he would return. I mean, we're talking about just coming back right on the date of Slammiversary. If it's a month, it's doable. We'll have to wait and see. The issue is, as I mentioned before, Impact Wrestling tapes all of their content in advance. So if Eddie Edwards isn't available, they may have to switch track and go in a different direction. I don't know if Eddie Edwards was at the most set of Impact Wrestling television tapings over the course of the last weekend or so. That's going to be interesting. We'll certainly find out more when Impact starts to air, starting on Thursday, and of course over the next few weeks. So again, Eddie Edwards could be out of the picture for Impact Wrestling television for at least a month, which is significant. So I don't know the situation right now. And again, I felt that given the outcome of the match, the 6-man tag team match at Impact Under Siege, which had the Impact World Tag Team Champions FinJuice, New Japan Pro Wrestling's FinJuice, with Eddie Edwards defeat Kenny Omega and the Good Brothers, I was surprised at the outcome. It was the only match that I didn't predict correctly, actually, which was again, I was very confused by the outcome, but the only thing I could think of at the time is, well, it seems very apparent, doesn't it, that we're going to get Eddie Edwards versus Kenny Omega at Slammiversary. Now, that injury could change things, so it would suck for Eddie Edwards. I never felt, to be honest, that Eddie Edwards would beat Kenny Omega. I just didn't see that, and I still don't see that. Anything is possible, though, I suppose, and that could happen. I just always felt that Eddie Edwards would have a situation like he always has. He's the heart and soul of Impact Wrestling. He would take a real bad beating, but essentially Kenny Omega would get the victory. I was never massively sold on the Omega versus Edwards match anyway. No disrespect to Eddie Edwards, but it's a case of he was involved in Slammiversary last year. He won the Impact World Championship. His reign was incredibly short. He lost to Eric Young within, a month or so? A couple of months? And that was just because Eric Young was just getting so over. His storyline, his return, his popularity was unbelievable. He was the top heel in Impact Wrestling, one of the top heels in the business at the time. You can laugh, but it was the fact. He was absolutely on fire. Impact had no choice but to give Eric Young the World Championship. So Eddie Edwards' reign was cut very, very short. And I know that in the world of Impact, he's considered to be a big star, and he's considered to be, again, the heart and soul of Impact. He would never go anywhere else. He's not going to go to WWE. He's not going to go to AEW. He's an Impact guy. I just don't know if I really have the interest in seeing Eddie Edwards versus Kenny Omega. I think given that you've got Kenny Omega for such a limited amount of time, because he's not going to be around in Impact forever, I think given that you've got him for such a limited amount of time, it's more important to have Kenny Omega establish new stars in the company. Make yourself some megastars. Have Kenny Omega face a Chris Bay. Have him face an Ace Austin. Have him face a Josh Alexander. Have Josh Alexander cash in the option C for the X Division Championship, cash that into an Impact World Championship, and then have Kenny Omega versus Josh Alexander in the main event of Slammiversary. Make some stars. Eddie Edwards is a made man in the world of Impact Wrestling. Everyone knows his commitment. Everyone knows his heart and soul. Everyone knows how much he loves Impact Wrestling. There's no disrespect to Eddie Edwards, but I just don't know if it's the best use of Kenny Omega while you've got him in the world of Impact. So it's up in the air. Of course, once we find out more, we'll talk about it here on the channel. It's certainly going to be significant, but as I mentioned, a lot going on in the world of Impact right now. There's some other stuff I'd like to talk about. We're going to talk about that tomorrow because there is just so much to talk about in the world of Impact Wrestling right now, which was to be expected, to be honest, especially as we head towards Slammiversary, but certainly a shake-up in the corporate landscape with Don Callis possibly no longer being an executive of the company, and on the talent side of things in the main event with Eddie Edwards possibly being out with appendicitis too. Look guys, as always, this is just one man's opinion. What are your thoughts on Don Callis only being at the Impact Wrestling television tapings for one day with AEW's Kenny Omega before leaving, and Eddie Edwards possibly being out with appendicitis too? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. I'll do my best to respond and reply to all of your comments. Really enjoy interacting with you guys, talking about Impact Wrestling, AEW, WWE, New Japan Pro Wrestling, all things pro wrestling here on the channel. So be sure to get involved in the community, drop a comment below. All opinions are welcome. If you have enjoyed this video, please do smash a like on the like button too. Really does help us out here on YouTube. Go up the rankings and get into people's recommendation feeds if they haven't seen our videos previously. But most importantly, if you haven't already, please do subscribe to Wrestling News 365. You can do that by clicking the bottom right hand corner of the screen right now, or if you wait a few seconds, there'll be a subscribe button at the end of this video along with another video for you to watch. Thank you very much for watching, listening, streaming, or have you come across this video today, and I'll speak to you again very, very soon. Hey guys, thank you for watching, listening, streaming, or however you come across this video today. Be sure to click on the video on the right there to watch our next video, or click the bottom there to subscribe, or the bottom right hand corner. Thank you very much, and I'll speak to you again very soon.